Hi, I'm Nicole Cannizzaro, and this is Compassionate Las Vegas, the podcast.
Welcome to Compassionate Las Vegas, the podcast. I'm your host, Will Rucker, and I am so glad you're joining us for this special season of our program. Today, joining me is an incredible human, someone that I just enjoy. And before we started recording, got to see a glimpse into her life with her wonderful child and just how she navigates being a human. So, Nicole, I want to welcome you to the podcast.
Will, I can't thank you enough for having me today. It's great to be with you and really exciting to get to talk a little bit about what drives me and hopefully answer some good questions. And as you mentioned, I've got my little 1-year-old Case in the background. So he's playing and is sort of just part of my everyday life. And I'm excited to get to talk a little bit more about what it's been to kind of add mom to the mix of things that I do and how that's sort of hopefully informed, my decision making in my serious jobs a little bit better overall.
One of the things I always share with couples, for those that don't know, I'm also a wedding officiant in addition to the podcast, but I share with couples that love is infinite. The more that you give, the more you have. So every time you add a new human to your life, your heart just gets even bigger. Would you agree with that?
Oh, I would 100% agree with you on that. It's hard to imagine, and honestly, I know a lot of parents. My parents have said that to me too. You have this child, and your heart just grows 10 times to fill it with just more love. And then we had this wonderful baby who has just sort of, I think, completed our lives. And it's true. I feel as though my heart has grown 10 times and I've filled it with a whole bunch of love for him. And, even when you feel like you've got a good group around you and people in your life who you care about and want to, be with and spend time and take care of and interact with, you add one more person to the mix and it just grows. It's a strange thing. And it's not, once you experience that, I think you really do see how true that is. Even though folks say it all the time, once you've gone through it yourself, it's just so different.
Yeah, and I'm watering up, so my I don't know what's happening. It's a morning or something, right? But that really does touch me, and seeing you in that element is beautiful. So something I want to ask is, how do you define compassion, or what does compassion mean to you?
Yeah, I think that's a great question and honestly a great one for all of us to reflect on. And so I've been thinking a lot about this, and for me, I think compassion is really trying to meet people where they are. We all have different life experiences, and even though we find ourselves in the same place, you and I on this podcast, and everyone who's tuning in, or if I am at work and I'm talking to clients and other lawyers in my law firms, that's what I do for my full-time job, or if I'm at the legislature with other legislators or advocates or constituents or different people who work in departments who are coming to ask for a variety of things, or even just here in my everyday life with friends and family. We all have different life experiences that help shape how we see the world and help shape what our needs are in that moment, and help shape how it is that we interact and care about one another. And for me, one of the things that I think I always try to do, because I feel as though it informs my decision, even though I might approach a situation a certain way, someone else might not approach it that same way because they haven't had the same life experience as me. And so something might be harder or easier for them to express or to do or to accomplish. And I think being compassionate really does require for us to look at people where they are and try to understand things from their point of view, because we all experience the world a little differently. And I'll give you like a really real example from me just recently and personally. I have nieces and nephews who I adore, and they're wonderful humans, and they're just such a bright light in my life. And but I'm also their aunt, right? I'm not their mother, and some of the day-to-day stuff that as moms we go through, I didn't have to experience with them, just because that's not our relationship. But having a kid now, it's like I feel a lot differently when I see a mom on an airplane with a baby who's crying, or a mom with a little kiddo in the store who's like trying to grab things off the shelf, or throwing a temper tantrum, or she's trying to change a diaper and there's no changing table in the restroom. And whereas before, maybe I may have said, oh, that's a horrible situation and I wish her the best of luck. Once you've had that life experience, you really get to see what life is like through that lens, because I have been in all of those situations. And so, if you can understand where someone is coming from, and their experiences a little more, I think that enables us to do things like, hey, mom who's trying to change your baby without a changing table, why don't I like at least hold the diaper bag so you don't have to, bend down and try to change a baby on the sink, or whatever the case might be. Or, hey, mom whose kiddo is, grabbing things off the shelf, maybe I could just stop and say, hey, little guy, what's going on? You want to play some peekaboo? And those kinds of things, just so that as you interact with the world around you, you provide them that space to experience what they're going through, or the space to get help where they didn't know they needed it. That certainly has happened to me. The changing table situation is a very real one. And as I'm struggling there to kind of change a baby, and there's not really a great place to do that. Another mom who's like, let me just help you. That moment of relief where someone reached out and touched me in a way that I didn't even know I needed, I think is where we find compassion. It's the human element. That's how we interact with folks. And I think the more that we can try to seek to understand where folks are coming from and the particular experiences that they have gone through, the better we are able to be that sense of relief in a way, for one another. And overall, I think that is, and I know I said that the human element already, but that is really what makes us human, right? Is caring for one another, and finding those spaces. And I think to be compassionate, you really have to think about someone's life experiences and how that has shaped their worldview, because even if you're in the same exact situation, you are going to see things differently or experience things differently than someone else is. And the more that we can seek to understand one another in that way, I think the better we are in our decision making, and the better we are in helping each other out.
Wow, so many great points in that. And what I really took away, though, is the importance of experience and being able to relate to someone. You may not have the same scenario, but you can relate to them on that emotional level. I've experienced the same emotion, but then also the added layer of, until you've been in that situation, you don't have the capacity even to
Yeah.
really understand what it's like. And I love that mom example, the changing table. I'll tell you, babies are not my thing personally.
Yeah,
Like,
that's
I
right.
love to be able to give them back. That's amazing.
100%.
But my
100%.
husband, he's fantastic. So we've kept his nieces and nephews, and he'll just change their diapers and do all the things. And I'm just there like, great, good for you, because I'm not touching it with a 10-foot pole. But it does give you a new respect and appreciation for just challenges in life. And I also love the temper tantrum example. My mom still has an injury to this day, because when I was a toddler, I decided in the middle of the grocery store, I was going to run. And I just decided to run down the aisle, and she, of course, had to run to try to catch me. But I'm like a toddler, so it's very funny looking. And she's laughing, trying to keep up, and runs and hits her knee. So it's like, those little things that I'm
Yeah.
sure everyone in the store looked at her like, why can't she control her
Why
kid?
can't she control her kid? Yeah, but it's that is exactly, I think the point, right, is that we all experience things differently, and you might see something from the outside a certain way, but the more that I think you kind of keep that in your mind, the better that you can engage in those experiences. And like, maybe, you're not like, why can't she control your kid? You're like, oh, look at that mom. Like, she loves her little guy and he's like taking off, and don't they run so fast? And then, if she falls, like, maybe, you can help in that situation. But I think, those are everyday examples. And I even think about when we're at the legislature and we're trying to talk about different bills. People will bring a bill that I've never experienced that. That's never been an issue for me. I haven't encountered that. And so, if you can try to think about why it is that's something that's important for them and why it's something that they're advocating for, then, you're not asking the kinds of questions like, well, why do we have to do this? This seems really silly. You can ask the kinds of questions that are like, okay, I see that problem and I see how you've approached it. I think that's one solution. Maybe we can think about it in this way, or that's a great solution. And I guess because I had never availed myself of that, and because I've never been in that situation. And so I think it makes us better policymakers and better decision makers. And the more that you can kind of do that, even in those situations where it's not just an everyday instance, which I think we should be doing in our everyday lives too. But when you're doing things at work, or, at a function, or if you're involved in activities, or you're involved in your community, you really are going to create opportunities where maybe they didn't exist because you're understanding someone else's, perspective of things.
Yeah. And you took me exactly where I wanted to go, which is when you're dealing with these major things that impact literally millions of people, and understanding we're all different and our experiences are different. How do you navigate that space of trying to have the greatest benefit with the least harm?
Yeah. And I think that's obviously what we all, I think, try to do when you're in the public space. And I'll use just the legislature as an example, because that's where I serve. And so I have, some real life experience there. But that is always, I think that's always the hard place to be. And we've been in a lot of situations where, you have to make a decision. And so how do you balance making the right decision or the necessary decision with not creating more harm or damage than is necessary? And how do you solve problems without creating more problems? And so I'll give like one example that I think is more attuned to how we can create opportunities by sort of being compassionate about someone's own experience and situation. And then I'll give one that's like a little bit more of where you have to make a tough decision, and how do you put those two things, how do you put that on balance, while understanding that everybody kind of has different needs at different times. So one thing that I always point to when people are like, well, why did you want to run for office? Why would you want to be in the public space? And do you really think you're making a change? And I always say, I grew up here in Vegas. My parents were a bartender and a waitress. And, I'm the first person in my family to graduate from high school. And so, for a kid like me, the opportunities that existed really did come from my community around me, right? And so one of the examples I always give is that, I wanted to go to college. I wanted to be a lawyer. That was a pretty big dream for a kid like me who didn't know, we didn't know anybody who had been to college. I didn't even know kind of how to apply to college when that time came and I was a high school student. But I was lucky enough to receive a Millennium Scholarship, which was just a scholarship that at the time, was paying a substantial chunk of tuition for high school kids here in Las Vegas who were going to college here in Nevada. And so that scholarship fund actually came because there were legislators, a lot of them culinary workers, just like my parents, who were working minimum wage jobs, but had kids and wanted those kids to be able to succeed and to get an education and to achieve something, but didn't have the means or the resources to be able to provide that pathway to their kids. And so they went and testified and said, look, you should take some of this tobacco settlement money, you should set it aside, create a scholarship program for high school kids, because that's how our kids are going to be able to go to college, right? We got to help them fund their education in order for them to have that opportunity. And because there were a lot of legislators and not a lot of them, I think and I don't want to misspeak, but I know for sure, Maggie Carlton, the assemblywoman and former senator, was certainly somebody who was a culinary worker, but most people who find themselves in the legislature, like myself, while I've worked a lot of those jobs going through school, in my day job, I'm a lawyer. And so it took a lot of people to kind of see things from the perspective of those parents and from the perspective of those kids who were just seeking an opportunity to understand that, like, not everybody has the means to send their kids to college, but they want the best for those kids and they want them to be able to pursue an education if that's what, their kid wants to do. Because somebody was able to kind of see that from that perspective and said, yeah, we think this is a good idea. When it came time for me to go to college, I had a nice scholarship to help me along the way, which was, a big piece of the puzzle of how do you get a kid who doesn't have the means to go to college into a college program to get an education so that they can go and do and be something, that they want to do and be. And so I always use that as an example of, like, why did I want to get into politics? Because I do think it can make a difference. And especially when we do things like that, like see things from people's point of views and try to provide those opportunities to succeed. One of the other ones that I mentioned is just sort of, when you are faced with a really tough decision, how do you kind of balance things and keep sort of the least amount of harm from happening while providing the greatest benefit? And in the legislature, that often presents itself in a situation where there's a necessary decision that has to be made. But how do you navigate your way around that? And so, we in the last few years have been dealing with the COVID crisis and the pandemic. Here in Nevada, that meant that we had to shut down the tourism corridor, which was a huge strike to our budget. We have to have a balanced budget. That's the law, it's in the Constitution. So as a legislature, we were called into special session and asked to make really tough decisions about where do you find money so that we have a balanced budget, but we're not cutting so many services from people that they find themselves without access to things like healthcare. That's a really tough place to be because so much of our state budget is education and healthcare. And it's very little everywhere outside of those two spaces. But there's not a pathway to not cut some things. And so it took a really long time. And I have to say, I had some very good colleagues who worked very diligently, and all of the folks we work with at the legislature and the governor's office to come together and really comb through, like, line item by line item, thing by thing, to say, okay, we had some positions in this department, they weren't filled. Let's take that money and add it to where we have that budget hole. Okay, we were going to fund this, library or this arts program, and that's great, and that's obviously necessary. But when we're talking about an arts program or kids who are on Medicaid getting dental care or having access to a physician if they get sick, you have to make a decision like that. There were some things in education that we were like, okay, this is a great program and it's doing a lot of good, but at the same time, we have families who will not be able to see a doctor and will be stuck with a bill if we don't, kind of make some decisions there. No one wants to be in that decision, and it was heart-wrenching, and it was awful. And for me, the hardest part was that I had constituents who were reaching out who either couldn't get unemployment or, were worried about losing their home or were worried about their kids not being in school, and trying to find solutions to all of that and put yourself in those constituents' positions, I think helped to inform our decisions so that we were able to kind of do the least amount of harm while also solving for the issue that we had to solve for. And then on a case-by-case basis, just going through each constituent and trying to say, okay, how has this affected you? How can I help? How can I find you the resources? How can I get you a solution to the challenges that are presenting themselves in your life because of the pandemic and because of the job loss and because of, all of the different domino effects that have come as a result of the pandemic? How do we solve for each of those? And that can be a really difficult place to be, because really what you want to do is just go in and, like, save the world and And sometimes that's not the option. So how do you do the most benefit for folks while doing the least amount of harm and trying to solve the problems that are before you? And I think that you have to approach situations like that with a lot of compassion. And for me, that means understanding where people are coming from and sort of meeting them there. Because otherwise, otherwise I think it's difficult to solve that problem.
My last question, you mentioned saving the world. If you had a magic wand that you could wave and save the world by doing one thing, what would that be?
Oh man, that's such a good question. But honestly, my mind immediately goes to that I wish we really could. And again, this is going to come back to my answer on compassion. But we're not always all going to agree on things. That's just, we're each individuals, right? And so we're each have our own human ideas about our lives and how we want to act and behave. But I always find that the more that you can actually talk with folks about things as opposed to just fighting or immediately going to anger, the better off that you are. And that doesn't mean that you're going to agree in the end. But it does mean that you can seek to understand one another. And I think that would make the world an overall more peaceful place. And I think it would help with a lot of some of the issues that we all have to deal with. And if that's on a small scale with like your neighbor and, fighting over where your trash cans should be on trash day, or, negotiating foreign treaties between multiple countries, I think the more that we can understand each other, the better. And so if I had a magic wand, it would be that people approach a situation in the first instance by saying, okay, what can I learn from this other person to help me inform where they're coming from? And that doesn't mean that we're all going to see things the same way, but I feel like it seems as though we're always, at least recently, more inclined to start from a place of anger or you're different than me, so I don't like you. And I don't think that ever sets us up for success. So if I had a magic wand to help like save the world and make it a better place, it would be that people do start from a place of compassion, but also a place of just, trying to understand one another, and not, immediately like anger and fighting or seeing someone who is different and thinking, well, they're different, they must be the enemy.
That's a beautiful answer. Thank you so much for joining the podcast. I've absolutely enjoyed speaking with you. And to our audience, thank you for tuning in to another episode of Compassionate Las Vegas, the podcast. I'm Will Rucker, and as I always remind you, you are not just a drop in the ocean. You are the entire ocean in a drop, and what you do matters. So live compassionately. I'll see you next time.